Hello and welcome to my credible presentation for LNGS 7002. First, we have the order of events, everything from introduction through to reflection, but let's get started. So, introduction. First of all, a little bit of context. So, the COVID-19 pandemic saw the world stop in its tracks and forced society to adapt to an entirely new way of living on the turn of a dime. And personally, as a brand new teaching graduate working in my first classrooms at the onset of the pandemic, I am extremely familiar with the challenges we faced in essentially redesigning entire curriculums and delivery methods with little more than a week's notice. So, while the struggles faced by learners and teachers during this time are well documented, what society has failed to take into account is the ongoing long-term impact this continues to have and on the students affected by the pandemic. So, students, regardless of what grade they were in at the time, face months of constant change and disruption to learning and were never given the opportunity to adequately recover the learning they had lost. And although schools initially worked to adjust learning outcomes to adapt to the changed circumstances, that level of adjustment has fallen behind, and students are now expected to be working at outcome levels that fail to take into account their lost learning opportunities. And as such, many students who were in primary school at the time of the pandemic are now struggling to satisfy the expectations of the high school curriculum due to not having developed professional knowledge, the foundational knowledge on which these skills are based. So, the problem students have not been given adequate time or support to develop foundational knowledge and are now struggling to achieve outcomes that rely on that knowledge. But why do we care? Essentially, we care because by not having this knowledge, students are struggling in ways that affect more than just their academic outcomes. They are inevitably falling further behind in achieving their learning outcomes and becoming increasingly disenchanted and disengaged with the concept of learning as a whole, which is potentially creating long-term mental health and self-worth impacts, negative ones, that is. So let's look at establishing the credibility of this project. So, many middle school students lack strong English foundations due to disruption of learning as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is supported by the My School data showing the NAPLAN values. Then, in terms of responding to a practical need, teachers need resources that simultaneously work to develop necessary skills of students while also addressing curriculum outcomes, but it's impractical and unfair to put this extra workload on teachers. So, this project aims to develop resources that are ready for classroom use so teachers are able to deliver high quality, effective instruction without the added burden of resource creation. Engaging stakeholders. So the material is being developed for and in conjunction with middle school English teachers at St John Paul II College in Canberra. As such, the materials are topically relevant to their curriculum, although there is potential for any of the resources to be adapted in any number of ways to other educators that may wish to use the material. Drawing on understanding of local knowledge and practice. As a teacher myself, this project draws on my personal knowledge and understanding of the challenges faced both during and as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as my knowledge of the demands of the school curricula in general. My knowledge is then combined with the knowledge of my stakeholders who have specific insight into the needs of the students that will be engaging with the resources and the specific requirements of their curriculum. Informed by diverse approaches. So the literature review and positive discourse analysis conducted have been, as part of this project, have examined how literacy-based projects across Australia, the UK, and the USA have been developed with respect to very carefully designed pedagogies that promote critical thinking and student autonomy. In terms of benefiting local communities, the materials are designed to effortlessly enhance the middle years English curriculum without burdening teachers due to their adaptability and will be able to be used over a number of years and also in many other schools. Leads the field. The resources created address foundational knowledge gaps that have had little consideration since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in terms of ethicality, the resources are made solely for the benefit of students and teachers with teacher input to ensure student needs are adequately addressed, and the resources are readily accessible through the design website with free access to all who use it. Okay, on to the materials themselves. So, the material developed for this project started its life out as a set of resources with the intention of turning them into a booklet. But after discussing this idea with my collaborators, we decided that we needed a centralized location for the resources, but a booklet probably wasn't going to be the best way to do that with the way that the unit was already planned, hence the creation of the website. So the website design is relatively simple with the homepage that explains its purpose, and a resources section with a page designed for each resource. So that allows for ease of navigation for both students and teachers. The resources themselves can theoretically be categorized in one of two classes, namely those with embedded activities and those without. So all the resource pages have detailed instructions on how to carry out the designed activity. However, those with digital resources to complete have said resources designed by me and embedded by me on the site. So if we take, for example, the Wheel of Fortune activity, let's just have a look at how this goes. So we have two spinning wheels. We have the first spinning wheel that gives you a literary technique. So this example gives us hyperbole, and then the second spinning wheel gives us an emotion. Disgust. Okay, so the idea with this activity is that students will then come up with a literary technique, a hyperbole that embodies the emotion of disgust. Um, so this is, yeah, this is just a really fun way for them to do like a quick and easy, like entry ticket, exit ticket. Very, very fun. Then an example of a page without an embedded resource is the whiteboard race. So the whiteboard race, uh, again, we can see the purpose of the activity is described and the materials are that are needed. And it's really key that any materials that are needed are ones that are going to be readily on hand, because otherwise it really affects the achievability of the activity. If it requires like a lot of setup and procurement of uncommon materials, it really actively detracts from the lesson. Then we have the instructions on how to run the activity, and then finally some suggestions for possible modifications. Um, then, for example, one of the possible modifications I have is the activity is described as a group activity, but it could be modified to an individual activity. Okay, now let's talk about the literature analysis. So, in conducting the literature analysis, it was first paramount to consider where this project sits in the wider discourse so as to adequately cover its interdisciplinary aspects. So the primary disciplinary lens that was considered was, of course, education, so as to understand the pedagogical theories that underpin teaching English in the middle years. And the other two disciplines that were included were psychology and socioeconomics, which allowed me to gain greater contextual knowledge of how students were impacted by COVID-19 and the time lost out on their learning. So some of the key takeaways. First, in considering context, we have the research of Hoofman and Secord, who conducted a psychological survey aiming to examine the current and long-term effects of COVID-19 on the mental, psychological, and physical well-being of students. And using quantitative analysis, they concluded that students experience much higher rates of anxiety and depression as a result of varying factors in the pandemic, such as economic instability, worried about parents losing jobs, extended isolation, loss of key social milestones like graduations and school dances, and increased tension within the family dynamic. Then we have the research of Gonzalez and Barral, who sought to examine the potential widening of the achievement gap with the onset of COVID-19 and subsequently evaluated the factors that contribute to such an education gap. So the findings that were most pertinent to my project showed that learning loss was greatest for more disadvantaged students, with advantage being defined as relative to socioeconomic status. And educational loss was cumulative and drastically widened the educational gap, which led me to the research of the socioeconomic breakdown of the students within my collaborator school, which we can see on the screen here. So from the distribution data, we can see that students at this school tend to have a greater socioeconomic advantage comparative to the national distribution. And then this is succinctly quantified with the ICSIA percentile of 80, which means that the student population is more educationally advantaged in 80% of schools in Australia. So finally, we have education itself. So a review from Akbar and Sadi investigated the common issues that were encountered when teaching language and literature skills, such as lack of engagement, curriculum limitations, and teacher preparedness, and resolved that careful implementation of proven frameworks and pedagogies have been shown to have significant positive impacts on student understanding and engagement. This study in particular looked at implementing the Learning to Read, Reading to Learn program, which I will look into. And the review really underscores the effectiveness of the student-centered teaching approaches in language and literature education. So, and these approaches prioritize active student participation, fostering a more engaging and responsive learning environment. So this then leads me really nicely into my positive discourse analysis, where I then sought to explore the success of the implementation of different frameworks in the middle years English curriculum. So the first framework that I investigated is called the task framework, where task stands for thinking actively in a social context. This framework was developed to be used as a teaching model to aid the development of student critical thinking skills. So there are, of course, numerous examples from the creator of the framework, Belle Wallace, that record her successes in using the framework, but I also consulted external implementations of the framework. So there's one study by Sisanta and Suryadama conducted a study to investigate the effects of the task wheel on student creativity levels in the area of middle years science. So the results showed significant improvement in creative thinking skills of students, which was significantly attributed to the active role that students took in their learning as a result of implementing task. And then we can see that in these two results down the bottom here. So we can see an improvement in achievement of minimum passing grade and improvement on thinking skills. The percentages by which they've improved are very drastically high. And then we also have anecdotal evidence recorded by Bella Wallace tells a really similar story with increased engagement, understanding, and most importantly, independent thinking from the students as a result of the framework. Okay, the second framework I explored is one developed by Matthew Lipman, which is entitled Philosophy for Children, and it was created with the aim of helping students develop critical thinking skills that would lead to greater learning autonomy. And so a study conducted by Naragi et al. Examined the role of Philosophy for Children framework in the self-direction and socialization capabilities of students by implementing it as a dedicated lesson program over 12 weeks with a control group for comparison. So the study found that the students who participated in the P4C program demonstrated significant improvements in social behaviours and abilities to self-direct learning, and we can see those in the results here. So in this table 5, we can see the value that we're looking for, the increase in the experimental group, and same in table 6, the increased value in the experimental group is what demonstrates that this statistically was a success. And so the results were attributed to the skills introduced as a part of the P4C program, notably the considering of others' perspectives, which developed empathy, and the use of democratic decision-making, which fostered respect among students as each person's input was valuable to their shared understanding. So the third framework I explained, and the one that is most influential to this project, is the Learning to Read, Reading to Learn program developed by David Rose. So Learning to Read, Reading to Learn is a literacy intervention program that was designed to develop literacy skills in students, particularly students who have experienced educational disadvantage as a result of social and academic inequities. So the program is centered around a scaffolding cycle that reflects the principles of the teaching and learning cycle. The scaffolding cycle consists of 6 stages that students move from preparing to reading through to independent text construction. And this program has been successfully implemented across Australia and the world by a number of different government and private education institutions due to its immense success. One such really successful implementation was seen it was reported by the Multilingual Research Institute from Stockholm, where it was noted that students that had migrated to Sweden had much lower educational achievement rates than those who were native residents of Sweden. So to try and combat this, they implemented the Learning to Read, Reading to Learn program across 7 different schools in Stockholm with participation from 22 teachers, where they focused on improving the educational outcomes of 58 target students. And results from that show that all the students recorded significant improvement in reading and writing achievements, as you can see from the red bars on the graphs. Those are the improvements. The teachers running the programs attributed some of the success of the project to the greater engagement and motivation in learning. Our students gradually experienced more success in reading and writing their own texts. So the key takeaway for my project from this is the scaffolding framework cycle that utilizes the explicit instruction and modeling from the teacher to meet the students at their current level. So the development of the resources. So the process for developing my resources began with meeting with my stakeholder to establish some key facts. So firstly, we discussed their needs and what kind of things would be helpful for them to have as a product of this project. And then we decided it was that ready-to-go resources and activities that could be inserted into the current unit design without detraction or distraction were going to be the most helpful. Then we had a look at the current design of the unit for term two and went over the topics covered, the outcomes that needed to be achieved, and the assessment task being worked towards. So as for me to gain a greater understanding of what my resources would need to incorporate. So the unit for term two focused on the topic of documentaries and students working towards creating and submitting their own documentaries for their assessment task. Because this unit was focused on film techniques, which is a topic that had not been studied in great detail before, this provided a really good opportunity to implement the learning to read, reading to learn scaffold cycle from scratch. So the first stage of scaffolding, of the scaffolding cycle, is about preparing students for reading, which involves them becoming really familiar with keywords and concepts before engaging in text. So this then allows for students to focus on the purpose of the text as opposed to expending energy decoding ideas. And so the first resource developed for this stage were the Quizlets. So Quizlet is a digital resource that at its core helps students learn terminology through flashcards and games. The Quizlets I designed focus on the key terminology from the unit and the definitions for these terms as given by the teacher, so as to remain consistent across activities. And once the terms have been introduced to the class, the teacher can then direct the students to the Quizlet to reinforce the knowledge, and they can use that inside and outside of class. So the second resource developed again worked to reinforce student understanding of key terminology through gamification, which led to the whiteboard game. So with the whiteboard game, it was initially developed for use with film and literary techniques, but we realized that it could be readily adjusted to reinforce any list of concepts. So its instructions are very generalized. The advantage of the gamification, despite the increased engagement from the students due to its inherent competition, is the activity can be used as an entry or an exit ticket to review or summarize concepts from the lesson. So the second stage in the learning to read, reading to learn cycle involves joint text construction, wherein explicit teacher modeling is paramount for student success. And having known that I would like to incorporate the task wheel into my resources, it was determined that this was going to be the ideal stage to do so. So because the task wheel deconstructs the process for creating text, the teacher can readily model each step of the process for and then with the students. So for the purpose of my resource, I slightly modified the version of the task wheel as seen in Bell Wallace's Teaching Thinking Skills Across Middle Years book, so as to be accessible for the cohort of students using it. So an additional resource to the task wheel was created in a matching game that was another nod for the kind of preparing for reading stage. And then the aim of the task wheel was then for the teacher to model its processes while creating a joint text, in this case, a storyboard with the students. And then a further, more complex activity that involved the students using the task wheel in small groups to create a storyboard without input from the teacher. So the joint construction activity was also designed to kind of increase the student autonomy as they chose their own topics to explore through the text. So the final stage of the learning to read, reading to learn cycle is that of independent construction. And much of the time, it is found that students are not given opportunities for independent construction outside of assessment practices. So I developed these two kind of low stakes activities that allow for the promotion and integration of independent construction as a standard part of the regular lesson. So the first activity that allows students to practice this is the Wheel of Fortune game, where students can track their own text inside specific parameters so as to focus their energy. And the second activity of Two Truths and a Lie gives the students kind of a wider scope for devising their text as well as prompting creativity and reinforcing learning concepts. So, implementation. With the first resources having been developed over the school holidays, my stakeholders were able to start integrating the activities from the very start of the term. During the development process, I kept coming up with so many ideas, but I really had to scale back and focus on the activities that would likely make the most impact for the teachers. I was just trying to do too much. And to this end, I was given really helpful feedback that the resources that could be used for entry and exit tickets were going to be the most helpful, because this is where they had the most flexibility in adapting the unit. And so many of the activities are review or summary activities and readily modifiable to adapt to the lesson. In terms of feedback from my stakeholders, one of the things they said was that the website really served as a valuable hub of activities to support students by focusing on the teaching of film techniques, which is a crucial element in leveling the playing field in English studies. And the resource broke down complex concepts into manageable, engaging formats that were both accessible and mentally stimulating for students. And then one of the other things that they really liked about the resource was it also provided this kind of bridge for parent engagement. in giving families insight into the depth of support offered to students, and then also allowing the parents to interact meaningfully with the lesson materials. Um, yeah. And so, in terms of my reflection process, I think one of the things that I achieved was the engagement of students with the uh, engagement of students with the engagement of activities, I suppose. Students were able to retain information. They were engaged in gamified versions of things. Something I would like to improve, a longer lead up time would probably allow for resources to be integrated more smoothly, whereas this time we were kind of implementing them as the term went along and then reviewing them as the time finished. I would also like to create more task wheel activities that would more explicitly break the steps of the task wheel down so they could then implement them. Yeah, one of the things I think that it was surprising was that the website was the most impactful for the students that were low achieving because it really allowed for like the learning support assistants to to deliver like one-on-one explicit instruction that was tailored to individual support needs within the school's contextual setting. So, whereas I was kind of aiming for like a whole cohort thing, it was more useful for the lower end of the cohort. And then references, a lot of people to consider. Anyway, thank you.